and welcome to the Venus Project Malaysia Supporters channel. My name is John Tan and I'm the Regional Coordinator for the Venus Project Support Malaysia. For those of you who are not familiar with the Venus Project, it is a non-profit organization based in Venice, Florida in the States. And TVP is a non-profit organization founded by renowned futurists Jack Fresco and Roxanne Meadow. The Venus Project currently has about 20 different regional coordinators in 20 different countries worldwide. And what the Venus Project actually proposed is a new socio-economic system called a resource-based economy. It is where scientific methodologies are applied directly onto the socio-economic system for the well-being of all people without exception and without ecological harm. So for more information about the Venus Project, please visit www.thevenusproject.com, and a link will be included in the description of this video as well. Check it out and learn what the potential of the future of humanity can be. Right, so without further ado, let me introduce our special guest today, Dr. Thary from Urban Biodiversity Initiative, UBI. So where we are today, we are actually at the Rimba Ilmu Botanic Garden. So you can see the very nice natural setting behind us. Very suitable for subjects that we're going to discuss today. Obviously, we're going to talk about all things nature, biodiversity, climate change, and some of the projects that Dr. Thary and his team is currently undertaking. So, Dr. Thary, once again, welcome to the program. Alright, so let me quickly share a little bit about Dr. Thary's background with our viewers. He's an entomologist, conservationist, and a wildlife educator. Holds a master's degree in forensic entomology from University Malaya, and he's recently completed his PhD in dung beetle ecology. He also teaches machine learning and programming to graduate students when he's on his free time. So once again, Dr. Thary, welcome to the program.
Yes, well, good to be here.
Yep, pleasure to have you here today. So tell us a little bit about the background of Urban Biodiversity Initiative, UBI in short, and what was the inspiration behind it?
Okay, so we started off actually as the outreach and education arm of where we are now, Rimba Ilmu, and that was attached to the University of Malaya. But after a while, we started to find that there are things that we wanted to do, but we couldn't because of bureaucracy and all sorts of, typical problems when you're working with the public sector. So we decided that maybe we needed an independent entity if we wanted to do our own research. We wanted to go in the direction that we wanted to go into. And we wanted to expand beyond just this botanic garden, but also towards doing research in other forests or other parts of the city. So what we did was we decided to have an independent entity. In this case, we looked into NGOs, we looked into all sorts of other options, and at the end, the thing that gave us the most independence was to have a social enterprise and try to see whether that is a viable option to fund our research and our outreach programs.
All right. So just for the knowledge of our viewers, how long has UBI been set up?
I think it's already been 3 years actually.
3 years.
Yeah, time flies.
Right. Okay, great. So the subject that we're going to talk about today is very much going to be centered around urban biodiversity, obviously. So it's actually a term or description that has fascinated me personally a great deal. So with modern global civilization expanding and exponentially, we have deforestation and unprecedented loss of natural habitats, not just in Malaysia but globally. So I'm compelled to think that there will be many species around the world, or biodiversity itself on planet Earth, that is inevitably going to be evolving and adapting to a more urban environment. So how do you see this developing in the coming years? And how do we prepare for this transition?
So, yes, so urban biodiversity is a really interesting topic because within the last 15 or so years, we've started to realize that a lot of animals, a lot of plants are actually adapting to the systems that we're making. So as we cut down forests, some of them have nowhere to go but our habitats. And in some cases, some animals are adapting in positive ways. For example, you have hornbills which are living in Singapore, have things like colugos which can live in urban environments, but also there are negative effects such as our monkeys, the macaques, which come into our cities and like go through your trash and
right,
steal food from kids. So it's important not to see nature as a static thing, but it is also adapting to us, just as we have to adapt to it.
So nature is in a way adapting and evolving as humanity itself is doing in the same sense. So the question is actually finding the right balance, isn't it?
Well, nature is going to adapt whether we like it or not.
Right.
So in essence, do we want to fight it or do we want to coexist with it? And that's the question that we have to think about.
That's a very good point. I mean, it's all about coexistence and learning how to go about our daily activities with as little ecological harm as possible.
Yeah.
Right? All right, so Dr. Thary, before I move on to my next question, this is something that I'm personally curious about. Now, there's been talks that 30% of the world's forests will be reserved for biodiversity. Now, in your opinion, do you think that percentage is sufficient?
Well, obviously not. It's not enough. And there's also a lot of problems when we set this kind of target of like 30%, because when you just give just a number, like a percentage like that, it doesn't take into account a lot of factors. It doesn't take into account the connectivity. It doesn't take into account the shape of the forest. That is, for example, a rounder area obviously has less contact with the outside than a very straight strip, which would have a lot of contact and wouldn't be able to support as much animals. So when we set these kind of targets of like 30%, you're ignoring a lot of different factors. And setting a target such as 30% also, it can become like a perverse incentive. You're just looking at amount of ground cover. And that can be abused.
Overlooking a lot of important and necessary support system for various ecosystems that thrives on those factors, right?
And let's say you set a percentage. So I'll give you an example from Malaysia. So in Malaysia, we have this target for 55% forest cover. But the problem with that kind of target is that you also have to look in the details of it. You have a target of 55% forest cover, but what is a forest? What is considered within the category of forest? If you look at what we consider to be a forest, there's also this category called the ladang hutan, or the forest plantations. And these can be like rubber plantations, which is just monoculture, or like acacia plantations, where you just plant a single foreign species of tree, and it's still counted as green cover. So there always has to be caution when you set these kind of targets, because too much simplification can create perverse incentives.
Yeah, and I suppose it will. There is a risk of maybe attracting certain invasive species if you have a habitat like that, which is quite, can I use the word artificial and not so natural?
Well, let's say you have something which is like a forest plantation and you plant it with like acacia trees for wood pulp.
Right.
The acacia tree is not a local species, it's actually an Australian species, and when it gets out of those plantations, actually it's quite invasive. So, yes, all of these create all sorts of problems, which is why, when you have targets or when you have objectives like these, you always have to think about nuances. When you're dealing with something as complicated as the environment, you can't have just a 30%.
General figure.
This is not a factory.
Approach.
You cannot have an industrial understanding of things. You really have to think about the whole system.
Right. Okay. That's a good point. So, moving on, you've been busy with various projects, especially during this pandemic. Being a speaker for various podcasts and nature and conservation programs online. Tell us a little bit about your latest project and what are you learning from it? What's the message for the public who is interested in that particular subject?
Yeah, so one of the things that we learned from working with urban Malaysians in all these cities and all that, is that they're actually really, really afraid of nature, really afraid of anything that's natural. You're afraid of bees, they're afraid of snakes, they're afraid of lizards. So a lot of cases, we're actually trying to convince them that, it's not so bad.
Right.
And what we found is that sometimes scientific facts alone are not enough to get people interested in urban nature. So what we do is, in fact, one of our recent projects is actually to document how the average Malaysian, interacts with nature. And this point of interaction usually happens in the garden. So, going like one generation back, when people were still living in, not in the city, but like in villages and all these kind of areas, or even in cities which were not as developed as they are now, the people used to interact a lot with the garden. People would plant edible plants, people would observe the birds in their gardens. So all these kind of interactions are looked upon very nostalgically by Malaysians, and that is actually a really easy point for us to come in and say that we could potentially lose all these things, and that's how we can kind of bring people on board to this idea that actually our culture and nature are not separate, but they are actually part of each other. If you start losing the nature around you, you actually start losing the culture around you, because we're not actually like, let's say, the United States of America, where the culture is actually quite alien to the nature of the area. I mean, it's like a settler kind of thing. One thing that we started to realize is that when you start to lose the nature around you, you start to lose culture as well. I mean, if you look at Malaysia, we're not like a settler colony kind of thing, where the culture is quite alien to the natural environment. People within Malaysia, within Southeast Asia, have been co-evolving with their environment for thousands of years. We're very much part of the environment itself. So when you start to lose the natural environment, actually a part of you you lose a part of yourself as well.
That's right. I think the culture is basically very much influenced by what the environment offers or represent. If you grow up in a small village in a jungle, the kind of games you play as compared to a city dweller is very much different. And if you grow up with that kind of activities, then it's very much your culture, isn't it?
Yes, but so one of the things is that sometimes these traditions have not been passed down to the younger generation.
And possibly because that environment is no longer there.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Right?
Yes, definitely. So, yeah, so it's kind of like a twofold thing. We have to like document these before the knowledge is lost,
Right.
as well as we have to think of new ways to present these to the next generation. I'll give you an example. So one of my friends, she's working right now on this project about leaf folding. So a traditional way of, for the Malay culture, one of the traditional ways of doing packaging is to fold leaves up. You know, you can very easily get leaves, they're a sustainable resource, and you can use that to package food. But
Like,
the techniques
a
to
banana leaf
Yes.
or nasi lemak.
yes,
Right.
yep. So the banana leaf is still kind of, some people still know it, but things which are more complicated, like the ketupat,
Right.
which really takes a lot of skill to fold,
Wave it around.
Yeah.
Yep.
that is actually being lost by the community. So, you know, you need to preserve the natural resources. For example, the leaves itself. And then you need to preserve the skills. And when you have both of those together, then actually that also preserves the nature. For example, the coconut tree is actually really, really good for pollinators.
For pollinators.
Yes. So whenever the coconut tree blooms, it always produces a lot of flowers. It's fantastic for insects, for a lot of different pollinator species. So you see how all of these are interconnected. And part of our current projects are to make these connections obvious. Because sometimes people don't really think about it.
Right. Yeah. If you take it for granted simply because you don't spend enough time in nature and you don't get the opportunity to observe such smaller details or appreciate. You know,
Yep.
you don't have that opportunity to appreciate it in
Yep.
the first place. Right. Okay. So, talking about pollinators. Now, my next question is about biomimicry. So during my recent engagement with a lot of fellow nature enthusiasts and some of the TVP supporters that I connect with online, from Spain, for example, it's a very interesting subject that we often discuss about. So we know that animal mimicry or biomimicry is random. It's a random process of natural selection, and it's without intent, so to speak. So, but it is often a form of physiological and structural development that is favored by natural selection. So, such as stick insect mimicking a stick to hide away from predators, or ant mimicking spider to kind of fend off certain potential predators as well. So my question is this: during your time as a entomologist, what is the form of animal or insect mimicry that has fascinated you the most or impressed on you the most?
So I think the best, I think one of the most interesting examples of animal mimicry which I've seen before is actually within a species. So I study dung beetles.
Right.
And one thing about some species of dung beetles is that they will compete with each other by locking horns.
Okay.
So there is a competition between males. The males will have horns because they live in tunnels, okay? So in these nesting tunnels, usually the female is at the bottom and then the male will guard the entrance. So males will often fight each other and then the winner gets the access to the female.
Right.
So in this kind of competition, the male with the bigger horn wins, because the larger male, the stronger male wins. So, you know, that's your typical natural selection.
Size matters.
Yes, that's your typical natural selection thing. But there are also within that species, different forms of males. So you have the major males, which are like the really big ones with the most impressive horns. And you have what we call like the beta males, which they still have horns, but they're not as big as the alphas. And you have what we call the gamma males, which don't have horns at all.
Right.
So, in fact, physiologically, they look exactly, morphologically, they look exactly like the female.
Okay, those without horns
Yes,
look
so
like the female.
they basically mimic the female of their own species.
And to what purpose?
So they have two strategies. The first strategy is that they just walk past the big horned male.
Without being attacked.
Yes.
All right, that's great.
So one is just a disguise strategy. So they will just walk past and then sneak mate with the female and run away.
Okay, so they get access to the female
Yes.
simply by looking
Yes.
like a female.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, okay, that's very interesting.
Another thing is that because they don't have horns, they're actually better at digging. So they can dig holes faster.
Right.
So another strategy is that, let's say you got a tunnel and then the male is guarding the front of the tunnel. Since they're much better diggers, they can just dig around, access the female, sneak mate, and then run away.
So they, in a way, that's favored by natural selection.
Yes. So
And they reproduce better.
yes.
With,
So
with better offspring.
yes. So what you get is kind of like a game between. So the whole environment is like you have a game and you have cheaters to the game.
Right. So it's kind of like a game theory
Yes.
scenario.
Yeah. Yes.
Right?
So it's not just a zero-sum game, but there are also people who cheat. Animals that
Yeah.
cheat the game.
So I read a book by Richard Dawkins, and it's called The Selfish Gene, right? And there was a phrase that I came across with reference to game theory, is that you scratch my back and I ride your back. So I found that very very kind of realistic about the natural world. But it's part and parcel of evolution and adaptation, and of course natural selection.
Yeah. So sometimes it's not just survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest can mean many things. It
Right.
can mean that you're better at digging and hiding or
Right.
disguising, or it can mean that you're better at fighting. So, as I said before, the natural world is really complicated.
Yeah. It's very interesting. It's very interesting, of course. So at the Venus Project, we often promote the application of scientific methods onto socio-economic systems through a systems approach. So is there or has there been a system approach that you apply for a healthier and sustainable urban biodiversity?
So, applying systems approaches to urban systems is incredibly difficult. Not because it can't be done, but it's because of the different people involved within the system. I'll give you an example for, let's say, flood problems. So very recently in Malaysia, climate crisis, huge floods, we lost billions in damages. And when people try to fix that problem, you realize how much of a problem it is. It's not just caused by too much rain. It's caused by insufficient drainage. But it's also caused by too much input. There's not enough areas for the water to settle before it rushes off into the river and floods somewhere downstream. So all these different things are interconnected.
And probably city planning.
Yes, you have problems with city planning, you have problems with the drainage department, you have problems with the irrigation department, you have problems with the forestry department, and all of these are their own departments. They're all sitting in silos and they're not communicating with each other. So when you have that, all these people just doing their own thing in their own place, they cannot solve this problem because this is it's a systems problem.
Which is one of the reasons why the reaction was a bit slow this time around when we had the last major flooding in Klang, for example.
Yeah, well, I guess they didn't really see it coming. So the meteorology department also didn't.
And it's difficult to kind of coordinate and apply that systems approach if you have every department acting individually.
Yes, well, looking back, I think that this is a problem with organization as well. When you start to organize people in bureaucracies and you put them in different departments, it leads to actually these kind of problems. So, sometimes the way that we organize society also is a problem, and that causes, it snowballs into these much larger issues that we have so much trouble trying to deal with.
Yeah, yeah. So on a community level, for people who would like to, let's say, for example, I try to rewild my garden quite a bit. So is there an approach? What are the do and don'ts to improve biodiversity in the community or in the individual garden, home garden, for example?
Yeah, I think actually we underestimate the potential of home areas, because when you look at, so right now if you look at the Klang Valley where we are right now, most of it is covered in suburban areas actually, and all these suburban areas, you walk around a suburb at 10 a.m. in the morning, it's mostly quiet, there are not many people around, everyone's at work or school or whatever, and there are actually a lot of animals coming out during that time and no one really notices. So there's actually a lot of potential as a space that we can share with wildlife, without which, you know, it will never overlap with us because we have different active times. So in terms of like planting flowering plants, in terms of like creating microhabitats which are suitable, like your household pond and all these kind of things. So all of these can help to preserve part of that. Maybe not all of it, you know. There are some animals and some plants which can only be found in primary forests, but you know, you can save more than what we have right now.
At least I think you'll be able to make up a certain percentage rather than not doing anything at all.
Yes.
Right? And you know, if you look around places like Subang Jaya where I stay, every housing community has a playground. And you know, there's a kind of a flower garden and they plant some vegetables. So those kind of space, could it be something to improve on for
actually,
biodiversity?
So when we think about vegetable gardens, actually, if you plant a lot of native plants, like all our gingers, lengkuas, kantan, all these kind of things, they actually become very good wildlife habitats. They tend to attract a lot of different birds. You know, you got fruit trees and all this. It's good for pollinators, it's good for birds. So planting more native, planting things which you can only find in Malaysia, you know, put a mangosteen tree there or something.
Right.
Really helps with the biodiversity.
Okay, so that's something I think it's pretty easy to do.
Yeah, and people like it as well. I mean, suddenly you get access to fruit, you get access to herbs.
And it's good for kind of bringing back the culture that you mentioned that might have been lost previously to the kids in the community, right? All right, so we have done some projects together, myself as a volunteer, and I've learned a lot from the project itself and what you have to teach, which I find it very fulfilling. But do you think that there has been sufficient effort by NGOs in Malaysia in promoting the understanding of urban biodiversity? I mean, similar to the kind of projects that we have been doing.
So when you talk about urban biodiversity in Malaysia, it's very much it's an issue with a lot of variety to it. Okay, it's not just within the city areas, but it's also within forest patches. It's also within the rivers. So there are a lot of NGOs within. So I'll just be talking about the Klang Valley as for context.
Okay, let's say Klang Valley. Let's say Klang Valley.
So like in terms of forests, there are a lot of NGOs which are trying to protect forest patches. There have been some successful actions. For example, Kota Damansara Community Forest. Friends of Bukit Kiara managed to gazette the Bukit Kiara Community Forest. Quite recently, in the South Kuala Langat Forest Reserve, also Community Action managed to re-gazette the forest. So there has been a lot of community organizations which have been able to push for protecting urban forests within the Klang Valley. Is it enough? Definitely, it would be better if, like, we had a bit more support. But I think with the resources available to them, they've done quite a good job so far. In terms of like rivers, there are many like river care organizations which they kind of like adopt parts of the river and try to regreen it, plant it with some plants, do activities.
I've come across one of them called Eco Warriors.
Yes, yeah, there are many.
They kind of like clean up rivers and try to bring it back to a more habitable state.
Yep. So a lot of cases, really it's about getting the community organized, and once you get the community organized, things can happen. But it's really about gaining that momentum, gaining that organization required to protect what we have. So that's one part of it. Another part is that in terms of like urban biodiversity, in terms of like thinking about the urban environment as a place for nature, that's actually a really new concept. It only comes about really around like the last 15 or so years in Malaysia. Because prior to this, a lot of our nature NGOs are trying to protect the forest, because that's where all the biodiversity is. And they've done quite good jobs as well. But that's where their focus has always been. And so this is kind of like a new niche. And that's actually why I'm doing the work that I'm doing right now. It's because it's a new niche, and we kind of have to understand the problem, and we have to come up with new solutions for this new area.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's very much something that we are going to face. More cities will be developing, the population will be increasing, so I don't think there's any way to kind of avoid this kind of coexistence. And the only way for people like myself to kind of do our part for nature is to actually play a role in creating a little bit of space here and there for biodiversity to thrive.
Yeah, well, in many ways actually, urban biodiversity is also about self-preservation.
Right.
For example, I'll give you that recent big flood that we had in KL. If we protect green areas and forests, that acts as a sponge and keeps the water from coming in and like destroying our homes. So it's not landslide. Yeah, it's not just about we're doing it for fun. I mean, this is like we're trying to make our lives safer. Yeah. We got the climate crisis coming in, and we need to take actions which will protect us against adverse effects of climate.
So you've been a scientist for many years, often working in the natural environment, studying and researching insects, plants, ecosystem. How much of an impact has climate change had on your field of work in the last decade?
Well, we are already in the climate crisis now. It's no point in denying that. Even very, very recently, I think we really had to come to terms with all these climate disasters which are going on around us. We had massive floods in the last December. Then there was another massive flood just a few weeks ago.
Yep.
It's happening
right
much
before
more,
our eyes.
yes, much more regularly and much higher intensities now. And a lot of the solutions proposed are still business as usual. So yeah, we see it happening at scales which we thought we would have to face in like 10 years from now. But it's happening right now, and it's really catching us totally off guard. So actually right now, we are in our part of the world, we have this thing called the ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation.
Right.
So that basically we shift between two things. One is the El Nino, and then one is the La Nina. So during the El Nino in Malaysia, you get really, really hot, dry weather. During the La Nina phase, you get very wet weather. We're currently in the La Nina phase where we're
It's
getting,
supposed to be.
you get a lot more rainfall than usual, and that's causing all sorts of floods and all sorts of problems with us. Actually, what I actually fear is when it shifts back to the El Nino phase, and we'll get really, really dry weather. And at that point, you would have to look at irrigation for food. A lot of forests might start burning because it'll be too hot and dry. So all of these things really can happen within the next 5 or 6 years. So, you really have to be careful.
Yeah, so we can see that in terms of wildfires happening across Australia, US, South America, which is, not just devastating for humans, but is just destroying more and more natural habitats on its way.
Yeah, and we have to be really, really careful about the rainforest as well, because the rainforest actually acts as a buffer to a lot of these climate problems. When it rains, the rainforest stores water within the roots of the system, and it slowly releases it. You can actually see it happening here in this forest patch. When it's too hot, the rainforest will actually release water, can create clouds, and that can actually cool down the surrounding environment too. So the living forest acts as a buffer to a lot of things. And as we cut down forests, we are reducing that size of forest. And if we cut down too much, we go below a certain point, we might actually irreversibly affect our own climate.
As in the water cycle, for example,
yes.
Right?
So that is a danger that is happening right now, and in spite of all this climate crisis, we still are deforesting in fact, the rate of deforestation seems to be going up. People are getting more desperate to make as much money as possible from the forest itself. So we have a lot of problems.
Well, I guess there are different things that we have to get our act right. Overpopulation, city planning, how we consume our food, how we cultivate our food, what kind of fertilizer we use. So there's so many different aspects to it, which we often think about as something organic, right? That you have to kind of live with, but it's driven by our values. So sometimes it's a question of values that drives us to behave in a certain way, especially in big cities as compared to smaller villages, the kind of lifestyle that we want to maintain and raise our children with. So misinformation, for example, is something that you see during the pandemic, and there's still, strangely enough, people who denies the reality of climate change.
Yeah, it's really a big problem. It has been a problem for the last 20 or so years. One thing that actually, if you look at climate change denial from like the early 2000s until our current year, you can see actually a shift between the denial. At early 2000, the people are still denying that the climate was changing. If you look at it now, climate change denial is either they are talking about, yes, the climate is changing, but it's all natural, there's nothing you can do about it. There's no point in changing your lifestyle.
So there's no human
there's no human element.
influence or element in it.
Or there's the other side where there's these conspiracy theorists who say it's a American weather weapon that they're using against the world.
Right. Yeah, I mean those mists in the sky.
Yeah. So it's all sorts of crazy stuff.
And I've heard about things like, we're going through a mini ice age.
Yeah.
And so that's one area that we have to kind of filter out information.
But one of the things which scientists have learned over the age, at the start there was this idea that if we could get the science right, if we could get all our facts right, we would convince people that climate change was real. And scientists did that. They did a lot of very rigorous research and they produced a lot of findings, but people didn't care.
So facts are not enough.
Yes, facts are not enough. Something that scientists have had, that bitter pill that scientists have had to learn is that it's more than facts. You also have to be able to communicate these facts. This has led to the field of science communication.
Right.
Yeah, and so we have to understand that sometimes facts are not enough. You also have to be able to
find the right way to present it.
Yeah, you have to be able to communicate those facts properly
and
to
it has
the public.
to be acceptable.
Yes.
All right. So in Malaysia, or in fact now globally, we live in an increasingly multicultural and multifaceted society. There's also a new dimension coming in, which is the metaverse. So, what are your thoughts on the importance of science as a transcending or universal language in promoting our relationship with each other? And not just that, with our natural world as well.
So, in terms of our relationship with science, we have to understand that scientific method is very important. This kind of skepticism, this kind of need to have empirical proof before you make a decision is very important, not to just do whatever you want based on what you think rather than what's actually out there. So there is a real need for fact-based decision making. And in fact, when you look at a lot of economic policy, well, not really economic policy itself, but if you depend on like a market, there is a lot of irrational decision.
Speculation.
Yeah, speculation. You got all sorts of things which are just like panic reactions and stuff like that, which in the long run are really a not sustainable way to distribute your resources. However, you also have to be careful with science. For example, our modern economic systems has the dressings of science. They have their own hypotheses, they have their own theories, they have their own models, they do a lot of mathematics, but it's kind of ideology dressed up as scientific method sometimes. So you also have to be very careful about that. Another thing that a lot of scientists, especially conservationists, are realizing right now is that prior to this, we've been very reductionist in our scientific beliefs. So what we've done is we've tried to isolate problems and understand that problem and then find an approach to it. Whereas the reality of it is that, when you're dealing with a conservation issue, you're dealing with society, you're dealing with governments, you're dealing with all sorts of other things. You can't solve problems just by reducing them to their component problems and solving each one at one time. Okay, so yeah, we can't reduce problems to simple problems and then solve them one at a time. It's all too complicated. We really need to, as you said, have a more systems approach to look at both the bigger picture and that data that we're getting from the smaller components too. So if you look at the cutting edge right now of conservation science, people are already starting to realize that it's not just about isolating patches of forests and creating national parks. It's engaging the whole of society. And if you don't do that, you can't solve these what we call wicked problems. They really don't have a clear solution.
So there really has to be a kind of universal language that you can kind of put across to different groups in a different location, different society, that is factual, evidence-based, and is realistic and acceptable to the different communities.
So one of the things that I've realized through doing a lot of science education, through doing a lot of outreach, is that yes, science is a tool that you can use within a whole bag of tools that you actually have, like culture, a sense of place. So when we have to communicate ideas, sometimes it's not just about a single universal idea that can reach everyone, but you also have to understand that each place is unique in itself, and you have to have a message which is suitable for the place that you're applying it to. If my friends are doing research in, let's say, a rural village, you have to do conservation in a rural village, you have to also package that with, let's say, human development. You can't just do conservation alone.
Yeah.
So it's complicated. You can't just try to apply a universal solution to all the problems we have in life.
But it does kind of point you to a direction, isn't it? I mean, if you're talking about a better future, and in terms of the well-being of the planet, humanity, getting such a message across using a universal language like science, it's essential, so to speak. I mean, we do understand that there are different communities and different culture, different level of education for many people out there, and some may not be understanding the language of science, but that does not mean that we should do without such a universal language, right?
So this is the climate change problem. This is the climate change problem. What we have found as we try to communicate the science is that not everyone listens to the science.
Okay.
And I wish that people would listen to the facts, but a reality that has come up is that there's just so much misinformation out there, and a lot of people are really good at misinformation.
Right.
That sometimes, even with science,
information can be distorted.
yes, in fact, some people, there is, like, in this world, there is a very big and powerful anti-science lobby as well. So, science, even though it does have a lot of advantages, a lot of useful uses, it does have problems as well in terms of people who are actively against it. In fact, you look at COVID, a lot of the science has been ignored because it's just not convenient for people.
So, yeah, I guess we still have a long way to go. Humanity has a big challenge ahead of us, but I'm hopeful with people like yourself that spearheading this better understanding of nature, biodiversity in Malaysia, and again, it was very fulfilling for me to be able to participate in some of your projects. Well, then that wraps up our interview for today. It was a real pleasure to have you here with us, Dr. Thary.
Yep.
And for those of you who would like to check out Dr. Thary's work with Urban Biodiversity Initiative, please visit www.ubi-my.com. That's www.ubi-my.com. Well, thank you very much for being with us today, and see you next time.